The air shimmered with heat, even though the twin suns had barely reached their noon height. Across the wide execution plaza of Virex Prime, alien banners flapped with smug precision. Thousands of flags woven in colors that represented the subjugated worlds of the Galactic Empire. The square itself was paved with blackstone that held the sun's glare like a cruel mirror, and on its central stage, two tall poles jutted upward, bound together with braided chains. At their base, a careful pile of firewood waited for the strike of the torch. The crowd pressed in, layers upon layers of alien species, their scales and feathers, shells and glistening hides shimmering in the oppressive heat. Some carried refreshments, others brought their children, as if the immolation of two humans was an afternoon's entertainment. Vendors shouted, hawking sour fruit wines and smoked grawl flesh. The chatter rose like the low hum of a hive, growing louder whenever an official paraded past with the sigil of the Empire's emperor, a flaming spiral swallowing a star. At the very heart of the stage stood James Carter and his wife, Laura. Chains looped their wrists, ankles, and torsos, each link forged of gleaming silver alloy. Their clothes were stripped of identity, drab gray prisoner's garb, a poor fit for both, as if the Empire had not even bothered to measure them before deciding they should burn. James sat cross-legged, leaning comfortably against a pole, as though it were the trunk of an old oak tree back on Earth. In his hands, a slim length of wood rested, freshly snapped from one of the stacked logs, and with a small stone shard he had found between the paving cracks, he carved it lazily into a point. His movements were slow, patient, almost reverent. To anyone watching, he looked like a camper whittling by the fire rather than a condemned man moments away from death. Beside him, Laura hummed a tune under her breath, something soft and melodic, though unmistakably human. Her fingers moved deftly with two long knitting needles. The thin rods she had convinced a board guard were sentimental keepsakes. Loops of yarn slipped through her hands in rhythmic precision. With every twist and tug, she fashioned not cloth but distraction, her eyes rarely on the half-scarf growing in her lap, instead flicking to every torchbearer, every pacing guard, every official's nervous twitch. "You know," James murmured, his voice low, carrying a warm drawl shaped by the Carolinas, for all their talk of ceremony. "They stack that wood poorly. Damp in the middle. Won't catch fast." Laura's lips curved in a smile, though her gaze stayed on her needles. "Well, darling, maybe they've never been camping. Suppose no one ever taught them to roast marshmallows without setting their hair on fire." James chuckled softly, a deep sound that earned a few confused stares from the nearest guards. Their captors had expected pleading, maybe tears, certainly despair. Instead, the condemned humans seemed as relaxed as neighbors at a Sunday picnic. High above the square, a balcony stretched outward, gilded and ostentatious, from which nobles in their jeweled robes surveyed the scene. Among them, a senator with translucent skin leaned to whisper to his companion, his expression one of both amusement and unease. "See how they jest? These creatures have no concept of dignity. They do not even tremble." His companion, a scaled aristocrat with eyes like molten coin, hissed laughter. "They are cattle with voices. Let them bleat before the fire takes them." Yet not all shared the laughter. A young page, barely of age, shifted uneasily at the railing. His species' crests usually glowed crimson with pride, but his flickered pale, betraying nerves. He had heard rumors, fragments of old reports tucked away in dusty archives, that humans were not as they seemed. But surely the Empire knew better. Surely. Down below, a crier in purple robes stepped forward, raising a staff. His voice, amplified by crystalline amplifiers, echoed across the plaza. "Citizens of the Eternal Empire, gather your eyes. Today you witness justice rendered upon two primitives who dared defy his radiance. By fire shall their insolence be purged, and by flame shall their weakness be shown." The crowd cheered, fists and claws raised high. The sound rattled against the walls of the plaza like storm wind in a canyon. James tilted his head, regarding the crier with polite curiosity. "Flame to show weakness, huh? Now that's ironic. Fire's the only thing that made us strong." Laura tapped her needles together softly, the metallic click lost beneath the roar of the crowd. Shoo, sweetheart. Let them think they're the clever ones. Wouldn't dream of spoiling their fun, James replied, his smile faint, though his eyes tracked the guards nearest the woodpile. 3 on the left, 2 on the right, 2 more circling wide behind. 2 relaxed, all of them. They hadn't been warned what humans could do when they stopped smiling. Torches were lit now, dipped into oil-soaked braziers until flames leapt high and greedy. The torchbearers stepped in rhythm, each movement rehearsed, ceremonial, an execution staged more for spectacle than efficiency. They approached the wood with great solemnity, and the crowd hushed, eager for the first crackle of kindling, the first scream of burning flesh. James cleared his throat politely, as though he were about to ask for the time. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying easily through the amplified silence. The aliens blinked, thrown by the calmness of his interruption. "Before we start, would your emperor prefer his prey to scream or to sing? I just don't want to be impolite." A ripple of confusion ran through the crowd. Some laughed nervously. Others frowned, not sure whether he mocked them or truly meant the question. Laura lifted her head at last, her blue eyes gleaming under the harsh twin sunlight. She added, her tone conversational, "I could do either really, but you'll find the singing lasts longer." For a heartbeat, silence clung to the plaza. Then laughter erupted among the nobles, high and shrill, their jeweled ornaments clattering as they leaned into one another, delighted by the audacity. "Primitives," one declared. "Such foolish bravado." But the young page's crest dimmed further, a pale echo of warning. He had seen something in the humans' eyes, something that did not match their words. They were not jesters. They were not resigned. They were waiting. Laura's needles clicked one final time, then paused, resting in her lap. Her lips barely moved as she whispered toward her husband. 3 guards left side. The tall ones got poor footing. Push him first, topple the rest. James' fingers brushed the sharpened stick, and his jaw flexed with contained readiness. Got it. The torchbearers raised their brands higher, flames licking the dry air. The crowd inhaled as one, the anticipation of fire already warming their skin. Laura leaned her head against the pole, feigning weariness, though her mouth carried the faintest curve of a smile. "Funny thing, darling," she said softly. "They think the story ends with us burning." James' teeth showed in the shadow of his grin. "That's the part one can't wait to rewrite." The crier's staff slammed against the stage, signaling the torches downward. The crowd roared, a tide of voices rising into the hot air. Fire arced closer, the scent of oil sharp, sparks leaping toward the stacked logs. And then James tilted his head slightly, just enough for Laura to hear the words that no one else caught. On 3, the torches descended. The wood hissed, smoke coiling upward. The audience leaned forward, breathless for the suffering they believed they were about to savor. James' hand tightened on the crude spear he had carved, every muscle in his body coiled like a drawn bow. Laura's knitting needles gleamed under the twin suns, her fingers steady, her smile serene. 1. The crowd's cheer hitched, sensing a strange rhythm, though they could not name it. 2. The young page's crest flared white with alarm, and his mouth opened to shout a warning. Too late. 3. The torches touched the wood. Smoke bloomed upward in a greedy plume. And James Carter, prisoner of the Empire, husband, soldier, hunter, leaned forward and smiled, not the smile of a condemned man, but the feral curve of a predator who had just marked the beginning of the hunt. The crowd's cheer faltered, replaced with an uneasy murmur, as if the air itself shifted, as if something ancient and terrible had just woken inside the chains. And in that moment, every noble and guard felt the truth before they knew it. The fire was not the danger. The fire was only the signal. The fire licked upward in greedy tongues, grasping for kindling, hungry to perform the Empire's justice. Smoke rose in twisting spirals, stinging the eyes of the nearest onlookers. The torchbearers stood proud, believing they had completed their role. The crowd leaned forward as one, eager for screams, eager for that moment of human weakness that would justify their jeers. But instead of agony, they heard James Carter murmur, his voice almost conversational. though every syllable hummed with coiled intent. 3. He moved faster than the eye expected of a man bound. With a sudden flex, the crude spear he had carved thrust outward, jamming between the woodpile and the platform. The leverage snapped his chains free of a post with a screech of metal. He surged forward, the spear spinning in his hand with a hunter's grace, and drove the sharpened tip into the knee joint of the tallest guard. Armor buckled with a sound like cracking bone. The guard howled, collapsing backward into his fellows. The crowd gasped. Laura's needles flashed in the same instant, flicking from her fingers like tiny blades. One needle sank into the throat of a guard raising his shock lance. The other struck the wrist of a torchbearer, sending the brand spinning harmlessly into the dirt. She flowed upward to her feet, tugging at her chains as if they were threads she had woven herself. The weakest link gave with a sharp twang, and suddenly she was free, standing with an almost bored composure amid the smoke. Her eyes glimmered. "You know, James," she said brightly, "I do believe we've caught their attention." The plaza erupted in panic. Nobles shrieked, scrambling backward, jewels clattering as they shoved one another. Vendors dropped their baskets, sour fruits rolling across the stones. The crier screamed for guards, though his voice cracked into terror before the amplifiers carried it far. The guards surged forward, but their movements were sloppy, unprepared. They had expected prisoners to burn, not to fight. James moved through them with ruthless efficiency. He jabbed, twisted, shoved bodies into one another. His weapon was crude, but in his hands it may as well have been forged by masters. Every strike landed with the patience of a hunter who had studied his prey for hours before loosing the arrow. Laura was different, her violence precise, like embroidery. She slid low, swept a guard's legs, then spun his fallen shock lance into her grip. It hummed with violet energy, and she wielded it like a conductor's baton, lashing arcs of lightning into the chest plates of two more soldiers. Their screams echoed, bodies jerking as the current cooked them. The crowd roared, but not with cheer this time. It was chaos, fear, confusion, awe. Children were whisked away, vendors abandoned their stalls. And still James and Laura moved with the calm of dancers who had rehearsed this performance long before the plaza was built. From the balcony, nobles shouted conflicting orders. Some demanded the soldiers cut the humans down at once. Others, suddenly unsure, urged capture instead. Their arrogance was breaking apart like glass under hammer blows. They had thought this spectacle a lesson in weakness. Instead, it was becoming the first whisper of rebellion. "Laura," James called, snapping his spear from one chest plate with a grunt. "Exit." She jabbed her stolen lance toward the eastern gates, where the guards were only just beginning to close the heavy iron bars. "That way, darling." Before they remember how doors work. Together they sprinted, their chains rattling, their breath steady. Smoke curled from the abandoned pyre, carrying the bitter scent of failure. Behind them, guards regrouped, rifles raising at last. The first volley of plasma bolts streaked across the plaza, sizzling the stones where the couple had been seconds earlier. Laura ducked into a roll, rising with a grin. "Finally, they're playing back. I was starting to think we'd bored them." "Careful what you wish for," James muttered, spinning to hurl his spear. It skewered the nearest rifleman, sending him sprawling into his comrades. With a fluid motion, James ripped the weapon free as he passed, snatching it into his hands without slowing stride. The eastern gates loomed, but so did the guards, dozens now, surging in tighter formation, their weapons steadier. This was no longer ceremony. This was battle. Laura twirled her lance, sparks dancing. "Well, darling, shall we make an entrance out of their exit?" "After you," James replied, polite even as he lifted his stolen rifle and cut a searing arc of plasma through the gate's locking mechanisms. Metal shrieked, sagged, then burst apart as Laura drove the lance home with a scream of energy. The gates blew open, and sunlight spilled into the plaza like a benediction. The crowd scattered into the alleys, desperate to escape the wrath they had expected to savor. From balconies, nobles stared, their jeweled mouths agape, as the humans strode free of their stage, free of their chains, free of the death the Empire had so carefully scripted. Outside the plaza, the streets of Virex Prime were no less chaotic. Alarm bells tolled, echoing across the towering spires. Sirens howled, signaling emergency. From every direction came soldiers, columns of armored troops marching with rifles raised, the polished pride of the Empire suddenly tarnished by urgency. James and Laura ran shoulder to shoulder, every step a rhythm of trust honed by years together. His stride longer, hers quicker, but they never broke pace, never faltered. Around them, the city was a storm, but between them, silence reigned. Silent understanding, silent calculation. They ducked into a market square, scattering merchants and customers. James grabbed a cart of glistening fruits, shoving it into the path of pursuing soldiers. The cart toppled, spilling a slick avalanche that sent the front ranks slipping and cursing. Laura used the moment to spin her lance in a blinding arc, sending shards of violet light into a fuel canister. The explosion thundered, scattering the rest. "Always were handy in a grocery run," James quipped as they sprinted on. Laura smirked. "And you always know how to clear the checkout line." Their banter was almost too casual, too human, and that made it terrifying. To the soldiers chasing them, the couple were not screaming, not panicked, not even angry. They were amused. They were comfortable. They were predators enjoying a warm-up. At the edge of the square, a gunship waited, its engines idling as soldiers loaded supplies. The perfect opportunity. Laura pointed, and James nodded. They didn't need words. They hit the ship like a storm. James tore the pilot from the cockpit, slamming him unconscious against the hull. Laura danced through the loading bay, her lance whirling, leaving arcs of smoke and bodies in her wake. Within seconds, the ship was theirs. James slid into the pilot's seat, hands moving with practiced ease. "Been a while since I flew one of these. Hope their steering hasn't gotten any worse." Laura dropped into the co-pilot's chair, brushing soot from her sleeve. "If it has, darling, you'll just have to show them how humans parallel park." The engines roared. Plasma fire streaked the air as soldiers on the ground tried to bring the ship down, but the craft lifted with a surge, climbing into the hazy twin-sun sky. The plaza below dwindled, but the chaos did not. Smoke, fire, panic crowds. An entire city shaken by two humans who were supposed to be ash. The alarms spread wider, carried across channels, reaching commanders and governors. The words were repeated with disbelief, but no less urgency. The humans escaped. The humans are loose. Laura leaned back, letting out a long breath as the ship pierced through the clouds. "Well, that went better than our honeymoon." James grinned, without humor. "Depends which one you mean." For a moment, silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the engines. They exchanged a look, one of pride, one of love, but also one that carried a darker current. Because neither of them had been surprised. Neither of them had doubted. This was not escape. This was step one. Behind them, the balcony nobles quarreled. Some shrieked that the humans must be destroyed at once. Others demanded their capture, their study, their dissection. And still others, quieter, whispered the unthinkable, that perhaps the Empire had underestimated these creatures gravely. The Emperor himself had yet to speak, but when he did, his command was simple. His voice, transmitted across the capital, carried the weight of arrogance, sharpened into fear. "Hunt them, alive if possible, dead if not. But do not let the galaxy see that prey has teeth." Far above, in the stolen gunship, Laura reclined in her seat, producing a scrap of parchment and a stub of charcoal she had secreted away. With careful strokes, she scrawled a note. When finished, she folded it neatly, placed it in a pouch, and set it aside. James raised a brow. "Leaving love letters already?" She smiled, wicked and sweet. "Every good host deserves a thank you." The gunship banked, turning eastward, away from the capital spire, toward the horizon where the suns bled into copper haze. Behind them, smoke curled over Virex Prime, a stain on the pride of the Empire. And somewhere, deep in the halls of power, the first tremor of doubt spread like fire through dry grass. For the Empire had thought humans weak, thought them fragile, thought them prey. Now, As the sky filled with alarm signals and the whispers of rebellion, one truth pressed against every alien heart. They had not seen weakness. They had just seen the hunt begin. The stolen gunship streaked across the copper sky, skimming low over the metallic spires of Virex Prime. Alarm sirens pulsed from every tower, their howls echoing like wounded beasts, calling soldiers to arms and civilians to shelter. Beneath the clouds, the city boiled with panic, but above, in the gunship's cockpit, James and Laura sat in practice calm, as if they were heading to a weekend outing rather than fleeing the full might of an empire. James' hands rested loose on the controls, guiding the ship with the confidence of someone who trusted muscle memory more than manuals. Laura leaned in the co-pilot's chair, her cheek resting lazily against her palm, though her eyes flicked across every blinking display with hawk-like precision. "You fly this thing like it's a pickup back in Boone," she said dryly. James smirked. "Easier than a pickup. Doesn't stall on hills." A blast rattled the hull as a plasma bolt scraped the wing. Laura didn't even flinch, only raised an unimpressed brow. "And yet, still gets shot at in traffic." Behind them, the rear viewport glowed with the pursuing swarm, sleek hunter ships rising like arrows, their engines flaring blue, weapons hot. A dozen, at least, more climbing from the spire docks every second. James angled the ship lower, hugging rooftops. "Remind me, darling, why we decided to get caught in the first place. Not that I don't enjoy barbecues with an audience." Laura smoothed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her smile sly. "Because if you want to gut a beast, you don't throw stones from the tree line. You crawl right into its den." She tapped a sequence into the NAV console, bypassing security locks with alarming ease. Screens flickered, then a stream of coordinates lit up: military routes, fleet postings, the Emperor's palace schematics. She sat back smugly, knitting needles now replaced by the invisible threads of alien code. "Besides," she added, "their capital systems are laughably unsecured. I've had sewing kits with better locks." The gunship dove through a canyon of skyscrapers, weaving past glimmering glass bridges. Plasma fire chased them, shattering windows, collapsing balconies. The city screamed. But inside the cockpit, James and Laura's banter stayed light, human, terrifyingly casual against the apocalypse they carved through. On the balcony of the High Council chamber, chaos reigned too. Alien senators argued, their voices shrill, their languages colliding. Some shouted for immediate extermination of humans everywhere. Others, pale with dread, urged study, containment, control. "They are two only," roared a scaled minister with slitted golden eyes. "Two animals escaped their leash, and you panic like hatchlings." "Two," hissed another, her translucent skin flushing with alarm. "Do you not hear the transmissions?" Other uprisings already spark across border worlds. Colonies report sabotage, assassinations. Couples. Always in pairs. Always humans. A silence followed her words, the kind that weighs heavier than screams. Even the Emperor's holographic visage, projected above the chamber, leaned forward, his expression tight. He had decreed a spectacle. Instead, he had birthed contagion. The young page, crest flickering with pale warning, whispered to himself as the chamber roared again. "It's not escape. It's the hunt." Out in the city skies, the chase thickened. Hunter ships bracketed the stolen craft, forcing it upward toward the open stratosphere, where the Empire's cruisers waited. The trap was obvious, herd the humans into orbit, where the capital fleet could erase them with one volley. Laura's eyes narrowed as she studied the formations. Classic encirclement pattern. They're not even trying to be clever. James cracked his neck, a predator limbering before the strike. "Guess we'll just have to educate them." With a sudden dive, he dropped the gunship below the hunters, scraping so close to the rooftops that antennas snapped like brittle stalks. Soldiers on towers aimed rifles too late. The humans were already gone, vanishing beneath the city skin. The hunters adjusted, swooping after them in a lethal flock. But the city was a labyrinth, and James navigated it as though he had memorized every alley. His instincts were uncanny, a sixth sense born of years tracking prey through forests and war zones. Laura braced against the dash, her voice calm despite the turbulence. "Darling, if you clip one more laundry line, you're folding it yourself." "Deal," he muttered, yanking the controls. The gunship rolled, and a pursuing hunter clipped a tower edge, exploding into fire that rained across the streets. They shot out of the canyon, climbing toward the eastern horizon where the city ended and the barren waste began. The hunters pursued, but the numbers were fewer now. Fear had seeded hesitation in their ranks. Laura's console beeped, and she tilted it toward James. Messages scrolled across intercepted channels, dozens of worlds lighting up with reports. Humans rising in twos. Silent, deadly, coordinated. Couples, bonded and lethal. James' mouth curved, though his eyes stayed on the skies. There it is. The signal's caught. Laura leaned back, satisfied. "You see, darling, we weren't alone. Never were. Every bond they laughed at, every marriage they thought quaint, it was our deadliest pact. And now it's awake across their whole empire." The revelation rippled outward through the empire as quickly as the message spread. Governors locked down their cities. Admirals barked into comms. Entire fleets adjusted formation to prepare for rebellions that had already begun. The aliens had thought they were the hunters. Now, for the first time, they realized they were being hunted. The stolen gunship streaked over desert now, the copper city shrinking into a jagged wound of smoke behind them. Ahead, the Emperor's palace glittered on its distant plateau, white stone carved into spires like teeth, banners fluttering with arrogant pride. James' grip tightened on the controls, his voice low. Time to pay the host a visit. Laura tilted her head, considering the fortress. Pretty place. Shame about the infestation. Behind them, the remaining hunters regrouped, engines howling. Ahead, palace defenses began to glow, artillery waking from their slumber. The air between stretched taut, charged with inevitability. James adjusted the ship into a shallow dive, skimming the sand dunes. Plasma bolts lit the horizon, but his path wove between them with the patience of a bow hunter stalking elk. "Think he's nervous?" Laura asked, her smile cool. James' eyes glinted. "He should be. He tried to burn hunters alive. Fire doesn't kill us. It sharpens us." For the first time, the humor in their voices carried something darker. No more teasing picnic banter. This was the sound of wolves who had stopped pretending to be sheep. They cut low across the desert, plasma fire streaking behind, until the palace loomed vast above them. The spires rose like spears against the twin suns, a monument to power. But as the humans approached, its grandeur felt fragile, a fortress unaware that the predators at its door had come not to escape, but to end the hunt. Laura tapped a final command into her console. Across the palace systems, alarms screamed as her infiltration bloomed like wildfire. Barracks doors sealed shut with soldiers inside. Artillery turrets twisted uselessly. Communication lines snarled into static. She looked at James, her smile now ablaze. "Darling, I think the Emperor just realized. His guests aren't running." James angled the ship upward, straight toward the palace gates, engines howling. "No, we're home." The hunters behind them fired in desperation, bolts streaking across the sky. One clipped the gunship's flank, alarms wailing, smoke belching from a wing. The ship shuddered, controls fighting back. Laura braced, steadying her hand on his shoulder. "Easy, easy. Don't give them the satisfaction." James forced the ship higher, his voice iron. "They'll get satisfaction when we decide they've earned it." The palace gates loomed, defenses sparking in chaos. The gunship, trailing smoke and fire, surged like a spear hurled straight at the Empire's heart. And for the first time in centuries, within the Emperor's throne room, fear cracked his mask of authority. The nobles around him whispered, their jeweled bodies trembling. The question was no longer if the humans could be stopped. The question was how many more there were, and how much worse it would become. High above, the gunship screamed through the sky, flames trailing, shadows of hunters still at its back. Laura leaned close to James, her voice soft but razor-edged. "Ready, love?" His eyes fixed on the palace spires. "Always." The ship plunged toward the Emperor's gates, smoke curling in its wake. And across the galaxy, as transmissions spread of uprisings, sabotage, and assassinations carried out by other human pairs, a realization gripped the Empire with claws of dread. This wasn't a prison break. It was the first movement of the hunt. The palace loomed like a fortress carved from arrogance itself, its spires gleaming white against the twin suns. Banners snapped in the wind, each one a declaration of eternal dominion. The stolen gunship tore through the sky like a wounded hawk, smoke trailing from its scarred flank, alarms screaming in protest. James Carter gripped the controls with steady hands, his jaw tight, eyes burning not with fear, but with the steadiness of a man who had walked into death before and learned to greet it by name. Beside him, Laura's fingers danced across the console, her expression calm, almost serene, though her blue eyes glowed with sharp intent. "Engines are at 40%, she said conversationally, as though they weren't about to crash into the heart of an empire. "Hull integrity's at, let's call it decorative." "Good enough," James muttered, banking the ship into a dive. "Pretty sure decorative's all we need." The palace's defense turrets spat fire, plasma bolts cutting white scars across the sky. Each one missed by inches as James weaved the crippled ship lower, dragging it through a gauntlet of death with the precision of a bow hunter threading arrows through branches. The city sprawled beneath, but all of it shrank in importance to the fortress ahead, the den of the beast. Inside the throne room, nobles shrieked. Some rushed to the emperor's dais, clamoring for orders. Others whispered to each other, with terror bright in their jeweled eyes. The emperor himself sat still, his scaled hands resting on the arms of his throne, though the rigid set of his jaw betrayed cracks in his mask. "They come to their own end," he declared, but his voice lacked its usual thunder. "They will dash themselves against our walls like the animals they are." But even as he spoke, alarms wailed through the palace. Systems flickered, screens corrupted, and locked doors sealed themselves shut. Barracks jammed, trapping soldiers inside. Turrets spun uselessly, their targeting scrambled. A virus moved through the fortress like wildfire, and it carried Laura's signature woven through its code like embroidery. The gunship roared past the first gate, skimming so low it shredded banners in its wake. It smashed into the second courtyard with a shriek of tearing metal, skidding across the marble tiles until it lodged, broken but intact, against a colonnade. Smoke poured from its hull, flames licking at the wreckage. For a long moment, silence clung to the courtyard. Then the humans stepped out of the smoke. James emerged first, battered but unbowed, his frame broad, his eyes sharp, his movement steady as though he had simply finished a long hike. In his hands was a rifle taken from the wreckage, glowing hot at its core. Behind him came Laura, brushing soot from her sleeve, her hair tangled but her smile intact. She carried her shock lance like a conductor's baton, and each step echoed across the courtyard with terrifying poise. Guards spilled in, weapons raised, voices cracking as they barked orders. James didn't slow. The first volley of plasma bolts shrieked toward him, and he moved like a predator among deer, ducking, twisting, firing back with single, precise shots that each found their mark. The courtyard filled with smoke and screams, but through it he walked calm as a Sunday morning, rifle steady in his hands. Laura wove through the chaos with elegance, her lance crackling arcs of violet across armor chests, her movements sharp as a seamstress snipping thread. Every strike was measured, efficient, leaving bodies in her wake without wasted energy. Her face carried no malice, only focus, only calculation, as though each opponent was one more stitch in a design only she could see. The guards faltered and then broke. Fear spread like contagion. They had expected prey. Instead, they had found the hunters. James and Laura pressed deeper into the palace, through gilded corridors lined with tapestries proclaiming the Empire's conquests. Each tapestry they passed caught stray sparks, fire spreading along the fabric like prophecy fulfilled. The halls filled with smoke, and still they advanced, step for step, together. At last, they entered the throne chamber. The nobles shrank back as the doors burst open, guards' bodies still twitching behind the humans. The emperor rose from his throne, his scaled form towering, his robes shimmering like molten gold. His voice thundered at last, a desperate facsimile of authority. "Humans, you come to die." James leveled his rifle with a calm that was almost polite. "Funny. Everyone keeps saying that. Yet here we are." Laura stepped forward, her smile sharp. "Your hospitality's been dreadful, by the way. Chains, fire, screaming crowds? We'll be sure to leave you a note." The Emperor's lip curled. "You are nothing. 2 sparks against a star. I will crush you here, and the galaxy will see how weak your kind truly is." James tilted his head, his voice low, his words carrying like a blade cloaked in silk. "You tried to burn us alive. On Earth, fire was never our end. Fire was our beginning." The Emperor roared, drawing a ceremonial blade longer than a man, its edge humming with energy. He charged, his form a blur of gold and rage. James met him head-on, rifle flashing, sparks showering as blade clashed against barrel. The throne room shook with the impact, marble cracking beneath their feet. Laura moved in tandem, darting around the duel, her lance striking at the guards who still dared approach. Sparks lit the chamber like lightning, shadows dancing across terrified nobles. Each movement was harmony, husband and wife in a dance of destruction, 2 predators circling, striking, never faltering. At last, James caught the Emperor's blade against his rifle, locking it tight. His eyes burned with calm fire. "You built an empire on the lie that love makes us weak. But a bonded pair? That's the deadliest pack Earth ever bred." Laura's lance pierced the Emperor's side, energy surging through his scaled form. He convulsed, bellowing, his blade clattering to the marble. James shoved him back against his throne, the great ruler collapsing into it like a carcass displayed at the end of a hunt. The chamber fell silent. Nobles trembled, pressed against the walls, their jewels rattling with fear. The Emperor sagged in his throne, smoke rising from his wounds. James and Laura stood before him, soot-streaked, weapons in hand, eyes cold and alive. Laura reached into her pouch and pulled out the folded note she had written before the escape. She laid it gently on the Emperor's lap. "A thank you note," she said sweetly, "for reminding us who we are." James turned, scanning the nobles with a gaze that froze their breath. "Tell your worlds. Tell them what you saw. The hunt has begun." And then the palace itself began to burn. Flames spread from the tapestries to the banners, racing up the spires, smoke rising into the copper sky. The Emperor's fortress, carved as a monument to eternity, became a pyre lit by the very sparks he had sought to extinguish. Outside, the city reeled. Citizens looked up to see the palace ablaze, its banners crumbling into ash. Across the galaxy, transmissions spread. Images of the humans standing in the throne room, the Emperor broken, the nobles cowed. On world after world, whispers became uprisings, and uprisings became war. In the heart of the inferno, James and Laura stood together, smoke curling around them, firelight glinting in their eyes. He reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation, their fingers lacing, their weapons still warm in their other hands. Amid ruin and flames, they looked less like fugitives, and more like kings of a hunt, apex and eternal. Laura glanced sideways at him, her voice soft and cutting. "Well, honey, I think dinner's on us tonight." James smiled faintly, the predator's curve returning to his lips. "Then let's make sure the galaxy gets a taste." And as the palace crumbled around them, the truth burned brighter than the fire-consuming stone. The Empire had thought love a weakness, but in the bond of hunter and huntress, it had awoken something far older, far deadlier. Not prey, not victims. The fire itself, walking hand in hand. The flames rose higher, banners falling, nobles scattering, soldiers trapped in sealed barracks pounding against their doors. The Emperor's roar faded into silence, his throne cracking under the heat. And in that silence came a single truth whispered across every world, repeated in awe and dread. The humans weren't running. They were hunting.